Hello, my name is Chris Dunn, and I'm the director of the Hydrologic Engineering Center, or HEC. Today we'll be talking about project formulation and evaluation using risk assessments. This is the first of 4 presentations, and in this particular video, we will provide an overview of the SMART planning process with an emphasis on flood risk management studies. In other presentations, you are introduced to the 3 major relationships required of a flood risk assessment. They are 1, the flow frequency relationship, or sometimes called the discharge probability curve; 2, the stage discharge relationship; and then 3, the stage damage relationship. Now that you know how to develop the 3 major relationships for a flood risk assessment, let's see how you can use these relationships to complete a study. Before we get started, it's important to be clear that no one expects any individual to know how to develop each of the 3 relationships. However, you should be confident that there are people in your office that know how to develop the relationships, so you will need to work as a team. The overall objectives for this series of presentations are listed here, and the primary objective of this presentation is to provide an overview of SMART planning. In later presentations, we will describe the formulation evaluation strategy. We will identify the without project condition, help you understand the analysis perspective of the flood risk management measures, and then how we compile, display, and interpret results. Pretty much everything I'm going to say in these 4 presentations will be found in one of the 4 references listed at the bottom of this particular slide. So what is SMART planning? Let's go back. In 2012, the Corps proposed a re-envisioned feasibility study process became known as SMART planning. With the same endpoint in mind, a technically sound, policy-compliant, cost-effective project recommendation to the Chief of Engineers. SMART planning is a decision-focused planning rather than task-oriented planning. It reorients the planning process away from simply collecting data and completing tasks and refocusing it on doing the work required to reduce uncertainty to the point where the project delivery team can make an iterative sequence of planning decisions required to complete a study. A wide range of alternatives will be investigated, and the alternative with the greatest net economic benefit must be identified. That's the National Economic Development Plan. The SMART planning methodology and framework were developed to facilitate more efficient, effective, and consistent delivery of planning decision documents, including early evaluation of the likelihood of the federal interest to determine if a study should continue or be terminated. So really, we need to complete a study using the 3x3x3 rule, which is it needs to be completed no more than 3 years, with a cost no more than $3 million, and with 3 levels of Corps engaged throughout the process. So the focus is on getting projects that demonstrate the greatest value and getting to them quickly. So we talked about the federal interest or the federal objective. So the basic question we need to acknowledge is, does the project meet the federal objective, which was defined by the Water Resources Council as the federal objective of water and related land resources project planning is to contribute to the national economic development consistent with protecting the nation's environment pursuant to the national environmental statutes, applicable executive orders, and other federal planning requirements. You may have recently heard of a new memo that was recently distributed. This memo was signed by the ASA on January 5th, 2021, and re-emphasizes the need to consider economic, environmental, and social categories, both from a national and regional scale. USAID's headquarters is reviewing this memo and will release further guidance on how to implement the memo in due time. So what is SMART planning? The acronym SMART, what does it actually mean? Well, S is specific. So the goals and objectives are well defined and clear on what needs to be accomplished. What outcomes do you need to see in order to consider the goal accomplished? Measurable. How do you decide whether the goal is completed? Attainable. Goals and objectives are realistic about what is possible given the availability of resources, knowledge, and time. Has to be risk informed. You have to follow the risk framework as discussed in the ER 1105-2-101 presentation. And timely. When do you need the goal completed? Well, ultimately, we need the goal completed in 3 years. So What's a feasibility with smart planning timeline look like? It looks like this figure here. In 3 months, you hope to have the scoping process done. The scoping process terminates or when you decide whether there's a federal interest or not. And again, that's anywhere between 1 and 3 months. This is where you decide to develop the PMP and decide what the contributions of the other stakeholders are. And the second phase, or milestone, is when you develop the tentatively selected plan. And so this is the vertical team concurs on the tentatively selected plan. This takes somewhere between 6 and 15 months to conduct. And then once the USACE team has decided on what the tentatively selected plan is, they then can send that out to public review or the independent external peer review. Then in between the milestone 2 and milestone 3 is when the review's going on. It comes back, and the milestone 3 is when the agency decides or endorses on the selected plan. So, and then for between 3 and 4 is when the USACE team and the stakeholders are developing details, performing a detailed design of the tentatively selected plan. And then milestone 4 is when you have the final report milestone, and then ultimately the state and agency review is conducted, and then it's sent forward as a chief's report. And then within 3 years, the chief's report or the record of decision is to the chief, and the feasibility study is completed. So all along, we are focusing on decision making earlier in the study process using a progressive and iterative planning process to address key areas of uncertainty. So the early tasks, so things that you need to do in that scoping period. Cost sharing agreement needs to be signed. A feasibility study does not begin until the Corps and the non-federal sponsor sign the cost sharing agreement. The non-federal sponsor needs to be told they need to develop an NED plan. They can't just simply choose their locally selected plan and use that plan. They need to develop the National Economic Development Plan. The NED plan does not have to be the plan that's recommended, but it does need to be developed. The cost of the analysis needs to be undertaken. The non-federal sponsor needs to be told that. And the feasibility study is equally cost shared between the federal government and the local non-federal sponsor. You need to prepare a project management plan. This is where you decide which uncertainties that you're going to focus on and how you're going to create the analysis or perform the feasibility study. And then ultimately, like we talked about before, at the end of the scoping process, does the problem warrant federal participation? Is there a federal interest in going forward with this particular study? So the feasibility study with smart planning takes up to 3 years, like we talked about, has to be performed under $3 million and 3 levels of review. There's emphasis on formulation, evaluation, and plan selection. So you don't start out in the scoping process with a detailed risk assessment. You need to develop something fairly quick so that you can get to the decision on the federal interest. The risk framework is required for the evaluation process, and as you move forward and get into fewer and fewer alternatives, then you get into more and more details on your risk and uncertainty evaluation. The feasibility study ends when the chief of engineer signs the chief's report and transmits it to the ASA, or the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. And the report includes all the traditional analysis requirements plus summaries from the risk assessment. So those are the things that we found in 1105-2-101 or that are required in the ER. Things like your economic, performance, and life loss metrics. So we have completed the first of 4 presentations. In this series, you're introducing you to the project formulation and evaluation using risk assessments. In this presentation, we provided an overview of smart planning. Now would be a great time to capture any questions you have on this session, and we can discuss them in our next discussion session. I look forward to seeing you for the second presentation.